Okay friends, so now we will going to discuss about 5 important toxin, or mainly the super antigens that produced by Staphylococcus aureus. Okay, so let's start this video. So the first important toxin that I will going to discuss about is toxic shock syndrome toxin 1, commonly known as TSST1. Okay, so this toxin is produced by Staphylococcal aureus at the site of infection. Okay, and it then enters into the bloodstream. Okay, and inside the bloodstream it will bind with MHC class 2 molecule, which is present on the surface of an antigen presenting cell. Okay, so I hope you know about what is antigen presenting cell, that whenever a foreign antigen enters inside our body, so it will be first recognized by, let's say, suppose it is a macrophage, okay, which is an example of APC. So macrophage will present a part of that antigen, which is a small peptide for the rest of the immune cell in our body. Okay, so as a result, our rest of the immune cell will recognize it and can show their action to destroy them. Okay, so that is the idea of antigen presenting cell. For now, you can just remember that antigen presenting cell are those who present the antigen for the rest of the immune cell present in our body. Okay, and they present antigen with the help of these MHC molecules. These MHC molecules are of two types. One is class 1, another one is class 2. So the full form of MHC is major histocompatibility complex. Okay, so major histocompatibility complex class 2 will present mainly, remember, those antigens which are coming from outside. Okay, that means exogenous antigen. Okay, so it is obvious that Staphylococcal aureus is not produced in our body. So Staphylococcal aureus is an exogenous antigen. So this antigen will be presented by MHC class 2. Okay, so now under such circumstances, as TSST1 is bind with the MHC class 2 receptor, so now it is obvious that TSST1 will causes the stimulation of immune systems, right? Because what is the actual mechanism? That MHC class 2 will present the antigen, and on the basis of that antigen the immune system will work, right? So here TSST1 will causes release of large amount of pro-inflammatory chemicals known as cytokines. For now, you can just remember about that TSST1 causes the release of pro-inflammatory chemicals called cytokines. Okay, and release of too much amount of cytokine creates a situation called cytokine storm. Okay, and this cytokine storm creates a various type of physiological conditions. For example, fever, sunburn like rash, low blood pressure, and poor in organ perfusion. Okay, and that 4 physiological changes together lead to the death of the organism. Okay, so these 4 conditions together are called toxic shock syndrome. Okay, so that is the toxic shock syndrome toxin. Okay, that means Staphylococcal aureus produce toxic shock syndrome toxin at the site of infection, and from that it will enter into the bloodstream. Okay, and inside the bloodstream it will react with the, or it will bind with the MHC class 2 receptor present on the surface of the APC. Okay, and stimulates the immune system to release too much amount of pro-inflammatory chemicals called cytokine, and this too much amount of cytokine together causes, or together creates cytokine storm. Okay, and this cytokine storm can creates, or can change creates various kind of physiological conditions. These physiological conditions are called fever, sunburn like rash, along with low blood pressure and poor end organ perfusion. And these four conditions together can lead to death. And these four conditions are together called toxic shock syndrome. The next one is penton-valentine leukocidin toxin. This penton-valentine leukocidin toxin is a kind of boxer. So it will create spore in the leukocyte, which is an important immune cell, right? So as leukocyte now having pores in their cell membrane, okay, they will die via necrosis. Okay, now try to think about this. If it is occurring in a large part of the tissues, what will happen? It will ultimately facilitate the organ failure, right? Because we know that organ made up of various tissues and tissues made up of cells, right? So as leukocyte cells having pores in their cell membrane, they will facilitate damage in the tissue, and this tissue damage will ultimately facilitate the failure of the organ, because as most of the tissues are facing necrosis, organ cannot do its job properly. So that is the penton-valentine leukocidin toxin. The job of penton-valentine leukocidin toxin is to create pore in the leukocyte cell membrane, which facilitates the necrosis of the leukocyte. The third important one is exofoliatin toxin. Exofoliatin toxin is another type of Staphylococcal aureus toxin. So exofoliatin toxin causes a special type of skin disease, which is known as Staphylococcus scalded skin syndrome or Ritter's disease. So this Staphylococcus scalded skin syndrome or Ritter's disease involve painful red skin patches with fulfilled blisters. Okay, so that is exofoliatin toxin. So exofoliatin toxin causes what? Exofoliatin toxin causes Staphylococcus scalded skin syndrome or Ritter's disease, okay, which involve painful patches of red skin or fulfilled blisters. And the last one is the hemolysins. These hemolysins will destroy erythrocyte or red blood cell and causes the release of the hemoglobin. Okay, and this hemoglobin contains, remember, iron, and that's how the iron now Staphylococcal aureus can use for their own purpose. Okay, so that is how, and that is the 5 type of super antigens or toxins that is produced by Staphylococcal aureus. First one is toxic shock syndrome. Toxic shock syndrome toxin, which causes toxic shock syndrome by binding with the MSC class 2 molecule and facilitating the creation of cytokine storm. The second one is penton-valentine leukocidin toxin. This penton-valentine leukocidin toxin will create spore in the cell membrane of the leukocyte. The third one is exofoliatin toxin. This exofoliatin toxin causes Staphylococcal scalded skin syndrome or Ritter's disease. This Ritter's disease have painful redness in skin or blisters. And the last one is hemolysins. These hemolysins causes destruction of the erythrocyte or red blood cell and causes the release of the hemoglobin containing iron that our Staphylococcal aureus can use for their own purpose. And another important one is enterotoxin. So enterotoxin is the toxin that is produced by Staphylococcal aureus in mainly food, and this enterotoxin is quite stable and they can remain active even after the death of the organism. Okay, that means if the bacteria is killed off by cooking, that does not mean that enterotoxin is also removed. Okay, this enterotoxin can withstand the temperature of 100 degrees Celsius also. Okay, so under such circumstances, if we eat those toxins, this toxin can causes diarrhea and vomiting, and in rare cases, if it somehow managed to enter the bloodstream, it can facilitate toxic shock syndrome. That is the symptoms like fever, sunburn like rashes, along with low blood pressure and poor in organ perfusion. Okay, and can in turn facilitate death. So that is the 5 type of super antigen or toxin produced by staphylococcal aureus. One is toxic shock syndrome toxin, another one is penton valentine leukocidin toxin, the third one is exofoliatin toxin causing staphylococcal scalded skin syndrome or Ritter's disease, and the last one is hemolysin, and the another extra one is enterotoxin. Okay, so thank you for listening to this class.